How the Mongols Defeated Their Enemies. Let's go. By Kings and Generals.
For millennia, the nomadic horse archers of the Great Eurasian Steppe were among the most fearsome foes an army could face in open battle, and the 13th century Mongols were no exception. In the previous episode, the link to which you can find in the description, we talked about the structure of the Mongol army. In this video, we will examine the tactics of pitched battle that made the Mongols the dominant military power of the world for a century. The strength of the Mongol army rested on the same skill sets of all steppe nomads: mobility and deadly long-range firepower. Doctrine for all horse archers was simple: to maximize damage to the enemy from as far away as possible for as long as possible, only closing once they had been sufficiently demoralized, their formations broken by an unceasing rain of arrows, or tricked into leaving their lines in an effort to pursue.
Just imagine it, constantly hearing horse hooves, the neighs are being peppered with fucking arrows.
Of previous steppe empires, adapting them as necessary for a variety of situations.
Okay.
A quick word from our sponsor today. Jurassic Monster World is a new Mongolian
so what are those
situations?
Let's find out.
Evolved out of the routines of daily life. Each warrior on horseback had several remounts, armed with 2 or more bows and several quivers of arrows. This was the bare minimum to be a combatant, and effective enough for most situations. Riding a horse from their earliest years and learning to draw with a bow from almost as early, by adulthood, every Mongol had a lifetime of experience shooting from horseback.
Just like the English
Nearly every
archers,
medieval writer
but
comments
more
on the Mongols' ensuing
because they could
hardiness
ride
and
horses
stamina.
as well.
The Mongols were able to endure hardship that made the armies of the sedentary world buckle.
Yeah, the same concept of like getting people to be trained from a young age just brings experience. Yeah.
Peerless archers and expert riders, any commander would be a fool to not take advantage of such an army. The Mongol army was not trained as much as it was grown. The basic tactics evolved out of 2 tools: excellent bows and a massive supply of horses. Every Mongol was armed with a composite recurve bow, which they made themselves. Incredibly powerful, these bows could send arrows immense distances. One stone inscription from early 13th century Mongolia records that Genghis Khan's nephew, Yasunge, sent an arrow almost 530 meters. This was likely a specially made light arrow designed for distance, and lacked any meaningful penetrative power at that range. Actual effective combat range is debated.
Okay, that's interesting though. But the fact that they make them themselves is so cool, because obviously if you have that knowledge, then if it ever gets broken, you have the ability to make a new one whenever you need to, if you've got the string and you've got the facilities to do so.
May suggests it was anything under 170 meters, while John Masson Smith Jr. puts 30 meters as the optimum distance to maximize accuracy and penetration. Regardless of the range, medieval authors consistently describe the Mongols as frighteningly accurate with their bows. In the Caucasus, where contact was easily made with several Turkic peoples proficient in horse archery, one Armenian chronicler specifically designated the Mongols as the nation of archers. Alongside the power of their bows,
how ferocious they were.
Was the other vital component of Mongolian tactics. Every nomad of the Great Eurasian Steppe rode a horse, where vast grasslands provided the ideal environment for rearing them.
Of course.
The Mongol horse is smaller than those of sedentary regions, weighing under 300 kilograms and rarely more than 14 hands or 142 centimeters high at the withers, the shoulders. Unlike the grain and fodder-fed horses of China, Europe, or the Islamic world, the Mongolian horses lived almost exclusively off the abundant grasses of the steppe. So prime is this grassland that even today, Mongolia's horses outnumber the country's humans and account for over 6% of the world's horse population.
That's a crazy interesting fact. Was it also good because it took less to feed them, so whenever they travelled, their horses needed less nourishment as the other types of horses within the areas?
When on campaign, each rider brought 5 or more horses with him, riding one a day
Crazy.
and letting it rest for
I
the
thought it
following
was
day
like 2.
while he rode the others.
5
like
or
their
more.
riders, the Mongolian horses were hardy, surviving in conditions deadly for larger breeds. Sure-footed, well-trained and obedient, though not the fastest, the Mongolian horse was a reliable platform for battle. Campaigning and entering battle with strings of remounts provided the Mongols strategic opportunities unavailable to their enemies.
So interesting.
This proficiency with a bow and easy access to great quantities of horses were the building blocks of the Mongols' deadliness in battle. Usually facing off against armies that could not amass any comparative number of horses or skilled bowmen, the Mongols enjoyed far greater striking power and mobility, their tactics maximizing this advantage and minimizing the need for prolonged close-quarter contact with the enemy. Perhaps the most recognizable manifestation of this was the caracole, what historian Timothy May believes is lent by the Shi-Uchi chisel attack mentioned in the Secret History of the Mongols. Waves of Mongols, organized in their decimal units, Arban, Jagan, or even Mingan, would ride towards the enemy, shooting arrows as they approached. At a set distance, perhaps the 30 meters or less suggested by John Masson Smith, the wave would pull away. As this wave fell back, the riders would turn in the saddle and fire backwards, the famous Parthian shot. With one wave falling back out of range and to safety to rest men and grab remounts, another wave advanced and carried out the same process, resulting in a continuous barrage of arrows. To do this successfully is tremendously difficult. It requires extensive training to not result in hundreds of men and horses crashing into each other or sending arrows into each other's backs. In order to function smoothly, each wave needs to know when the other wave is advancing or falling back and move accordingly, so as not to obstruct the forthcoming waves.
Such a military feat, the Mongol army.
It was extraordinarily effective. For those subject to the Mongol caracole, it was an immense psychological attack alongside the storm of arrows. By nature, humans do not generally enjoy having large groups of horses run towards them. Having it occur repeatedly brings on the additional anxiety of not knowing which wave might not turn away, but ride directly into their lines. All the while, arrows with shocking
fucking terrifying. It's so true. You just don't know which one's actually going to crash into you and actually cause that close combat where you have to get into the thick of it. Do you know what I mean? You just can't ever be restless.
Accuracy and power pick away at the other men in the line, whittling down both numbers and resolve. To someone on foot, the successive waves of horsemen would be impossible to count, appearing endless. Even well-trained men would struggle to fight their instincts to flee or charge out at the enemy in anger, both options aligning exactly with Mongol desires.
How the Mongols work.
If the enemy began to rout under the arrow fire, then instead of pulling back, one wave would instead charge into the enemy, falling upon fleeing men and taking advantage of the opening in the line. An enemy army in the midst of flight would be unable to resist, allowing the Mongols to ride them down much easier. If instead the enemy, especially proud cavalrymen, attempted to charge the Mongol caracole, then this allowed the Mongols to employ the favourite ploy of all steppe warriors, the feigned retreat. A feigned retreat is easy enough,
which we've seen so many times throughout the series.
When an enemy ran after the Mongols would appear to flee, panicked by the charge of the very brave and well-armoured enemy
until
horsemen.
they get restless
there
and
was
then
a
turn
real
around.
danger of the feigned rout turning into a real one if the enemy horsemen reached the Mongols. Their often superior armour and training would allow them to wreak havoc on more lightly armoured Mongols. If orchestrated properly, however, the fleeing Mongols took their pursuers to ground of their choosing, where other Mongol units waited in preparation. Archers picked off the isolated enemy, and heavy cavalry delivered the final blow to the stragglers. If this had been all the enemy cavalry, the Mongols could then easily surround the surviving infantry and pick them off at their leisure. The feigned retreat was employed again and again across Eurasia.
So many
against
times.
fortresses where garrisons were
so
trapped
many
coming
people
out
fell
from
for
their
it.
walls to chase fleeing
You only
nomads.
fell for it once or
Two
twice though,
epic
didn't you?
9-day pursuits.
Normally once.
The most famous was that which Subutai employed against the Rus and Kipchak at the Kalka River. Perhaps not quite the master plan it is often presented as, Subutai may have been genuinely fleeing before the Rus and Kipchak, following the death of his friend and mentor Jebe while scouting the enemy army, as suggested in a recent article by historian Stefan Pau. Pursued across the steppe, Subutai saw the enemy formation lose structure, the faster Kuman Kipchaks gaining ahead of their Rus allies. Turning back to face them, on the Kalka River, Subutai brought the full might of his army against only a portion of the enemy. First, the Kipchak, who broke and ran into the oncoming Rus. With their advance halted, Mongol arrows now fell upon them. Order was lost, the Rus began to flee, and Subutai carried the day, annihilating the enemy army. In the event that the enemy did not pursue or rout, but instead held their position in orderly formation, the Mongols had
the Mongols had no chance.
Simply moving on.
Oh, they did?
More
they had
than their enemies, and always fighting in enemy territory.
They could just move on,
I see. Pull away and ravage the surrounding countryside, disheartening the enemy army by slaughtering the local population, filling the sky with the smoke
just that
of burning
terror.
Homes, or cutting off enemy access to
terror
water
warfare.
or resources. Defections and panic set in as refugees fled to the army with stories of Mongol brutality. A stationary foe, or one holding up in a wagon fort as the Hungarians did at Mohi in 1242, was soon trapped in a nege, a Mongolian hunting circle. Cordoning off the area, the Mongols would surround and gradually close in on the foe, cutting off avenues of escape and driving panicked villagers towards the target.
I see.
At the strategic level, or while hunting, strict orders allowed nothing to leave the circle alive. But on the tactical level, the nege had a devious trick. A gap would be left in the steadily closing circle,
people would come pouring out and then they would
by
close
the
it.
overeager Mongols. To those on foot, it seemed a silver lining. The Mongols understood the psychology of men and animals. When cornered with nowhere to run, they fight to the death. Provided a means to see another day, either tiger or man will seize the chance to live. And by doing so, they did exactly what the Mongols wanted. At Mohi, when the Hungarians fled through the gap in the line, the Mongols formed up beside the fleeing enemy, whose formation and sense to resist was long
just
since
completely
abandoned.
broken.
Once the foe was suitably bedraggled and exhausted, only then did the Mongols fall upon them, minimizing harm to themselves, but ensuring few, if any, escaped their clutches. Contrary
Always
to some
taking
pictures,
advantage
heavy
of
cavalry
every
was used
little
by the Mongols, though
bit
Asian cavalry differed from the heavy shock lancers imagined in Europe when the term is mentioned. For the Mongols,
had
their
light
own
cavalry.
heavy armored cavalry was a minority, more usually utilizing subject peoples in this role. For the majority of Asian heavy cavalry, from China, Iran and the Turkic and Mongolian tribes of Central Asia, the primary weapon of heavy cavalry was still the bow, even when both horse and rider were fully armored. In the steppe, heavy armor was harder to procure with limited access to smiths and raw materials. The more common armor varieties reflected this, created from materials the Mongols had ready access to, felt and leather. Perhaps the most well-known was the Hatanga Del, a sort of thick, gambeson-like coat of thickly layered felt. Increasingly over the 13th century, the Hatanga was secured with metal plates within it for a brigandine. For man and horse protection, lamina was favoured,
just a bit more.
long
That's how they
layered
upgraded
bands
it.
of leather laced together. The most expensive was lamella, consisting of individual metal plates sewn together in rows.
We've seen that.
Flexible, the armor was designed to fold over the legs while on horseback, though the arms and hands were left exposed to not encumber usage of the bow. The Mongols considered lamella better protection against arrows than mail, as well as easier for nomads to both produce and maintain. Mongolian heavy cavalry was intended to be a decisive finishing blow against enemies weakened by arrow fire or drawn into feigned retreats, rather than engage in any sort of prolonged melee.
Just basically they're the ones to go in and really finish up, but cause a devastating blow whilst doing it.
Especially when fully armoured, and heavy cavalry charges were likely limited affairs in the early days of the conquests.
They'll become more relevant later on.
Peoples were added to the Mongol army. Their own heavy cavalry would take on these vulnerable close-quarter roles. leaving the valuable Mongolian and Turkic horse archers safe to pick off the enemy from a distance. While fighting in China, Khitan, Jurchen and Tangut heavy cavalry were regularly employed by the Mongols, while in the Ilkhanate, Armenian and Georgian heavy cavalry were at the forefront of the Mongol wars in the region, particularly against the Mamluks.
Oh, I didn't know that, against the Mamluks.
For extraordinary situations, the Mongols applied unorthodox tactics. At Mohi in 1241, the initial effort to storm the bridge was accompanied by Subutai attempting to build a bridge further downriver in an effort to flank the Hungarian army. When the Hungarians successfully resisted an attempt to force the bridge, the Mongols pulled back and early the following morning brought up catapults and shelled the guards left on the Hungarian side of the bridge. This was quickly followed up by a cavalry charge. The bridge over the Sayo River was taken and the Hungarian camp encircled. While fighting off a Burmese invasion into Mongol-controlled Yunnan in 1277, the sight and scent of the Burmese elephants frightened the Mongol horses. The Mongol commander quickly ordered his men to the tree line to tie them to the tree trunks. Dismounted, the Mongols advanced on foot and sent volleys of arrows into the elephants. Under the incessant barrage, the elephants panicked, crashing through the Burmese lines before leaving the battlefield.
Then they got back on their horses,
right? While part of the Mongol force continued providing covering fire, detachments filed back to the trees to remount their horses, continuing in this order until they were all on horseback.
Nice.
Where the Mongols' tactical ability
to adapt
was an environment too unsuited to cavalry maneuvers. The humid jungles of Southeastern Asia, perhaps the greatest example of this.
Like in Korea.
The conquest of the Song dynasty was only completed with the massive conscription of Chinese soldiers and creation of a fleet to challenge the Song on the vital rivers of South China. In Syria, historians like John Masson Smith have argued the region lacked the pasture capacity to provide for the vast horse herds the Mongols liked to bring with them,
which would make sense in Syria.
With smaller forces the Mamluks could overcome.
Okay.
In straight tactical engagements, the Mongols performed their poorest against those who fought in similar fashion to themselves. Genghis Khan's only defeats were against other tribes of the Mongolian steppe, and it seemed he considered the nomadic Turks of the western steppe, the Kuman Kipchaks, to be the single greatest foe against Mongol expansion.
Interesting, that's from Genghis himself.
And the Sultanate of Delhi both employed Turkic horse archers, often Kuman Kipchaks bought as slaves, to great effect against the Mongols.
Okay.
Essentially, these were armies which could recognize feigned retreats and nomadic ploys, and force the Mongols into engagements which minimized their superiority
because they knew what they were dealing with, which makes sense.
We will continue to explore the Mongol army in future videos, so please make sure you've subscribed and pressed the bell button.
And you know I am, and if you haven't already, head over to that content creators page, that link's in the description box down below. I always enjoy these reactions. Kings and Generals make amazing content. Thoroughly enjoyed this one. I'm looking forward to the next episode. You know what you need to do. You need to like, comment, subscribe, hit that notification bell, but I will catch you in the next video.